Inner Chaos by Grevin Hades. Chapter 5 Introductions. Grevin let out a groan as he woke to the feeling of a cold breeze buffeting over his body. Bringing a hand to his face to block some of the cold air, he realized that there was something wrong. Where he just was, there was no bitter, howling wind or cold chill. Jerking forward into a sitting position, he looked around quickly, trying to figure out his surroundings. What met his gaze made his jaw drop. He found himself sitting in a small snowbank high in Invas's mountains, where this whole journey had begun. He sat there for a few moments, the sound of the wind whistling through the mountains the only sound, before his eyes widened as the realization came to him. What if he had just slipped and hit his head? What if the whole thing was a simple hallucination from a head wound? He quickly brought a hand to the back of his head, only to feel no pain that would accompany such an incident. He frowned as he slowly rose to his feet, being sure to brush off as much snow from his person as he could. He looked around once more, taking note that the sun, the trees, even the cold were the same as they were when he had been pulled into that strange portal. It was then that his training finally kicked in. Perhaps he had fell victim to an illusion spell rather than a head wound. A hallucination would be the same result, and if it was meant to slow him, then it would explain why he was sitting down with the snowdrift. He quickly closed his eyes in concentration, trying to bring forth his magic once again into his hands to see if there was any signs of foul play. But something was wrong. His concentration was doing nothing. It was almost as if he couldn't use his magic at all. His eyes furrowed as he tried harder, but still his reward was nothing. His eyes snapped open, and despite the cold, a nervous sweat began to bead on his neck. If he couldn't use his abilities, then what could he do to help Bastion? He shook his head and pushed his worry into the back of his mind. He quickly found his bearings and began to walk down the all too familiar rock path that he was once on before. It didn't matter if he could use magic or not. He could still fight as long as he had his weapons. He paused mid-stride as that thought hit. He hadn't even checked to see if he had everything. If someone or something had incapacitated him, then they could have taken his belongings. Reaching a hand back, he tried to find the pack that he tied over his shoulder. He felt a surge of hope when the familiar surface of the cloth bag was touched by his gloved hand. Next, he reached for his sword, both on his hip and back. His good spirits were quickly crushed when he found them missing. He clenched his fist in anger, a growl coming to his throat. The sword on his back was the only thing he had that remained of his father. He cherished that blade. The other was a relic from ruins he had traveled through. Supposedly, it was meant to be a great weapon of his race, but he never saw anything special about it, except that it was a very good blade. Grevin sighed as he lowered his hands and once again began to step forward, a look of anger and determination showing in his very stride. He knew that he was still the best hope for the land, and he would do everything he could to fight the impending evil. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted as a large, cold burst of wind slammed into him, causing him to step back as he brought his hands to his face in an attempt to block some of the freezing snow from cutting into him. Taking another step back, the wind seemed to increase, and then he heard something, a deep, low laugh that grew in volume with every gust of wind. Narrowing his eyes, Grevin placed one foot back, preparing to move quickly if he needed to. The voice grew louder and louder until the very rocks of the mountain shook before lowering in volume and fading. Then he heard the voice. "You can't save them, you know." It was a deep voice, a voice that was rough and confident and dark. The kind of voice that came from an adversary who had you right where they wanted you, and knew it. He grit his teeth as he stood his ground. "Save who? Who are you?" The voice laughed, the very sound of it sending a shiver down his spine. "Why, I'm talking about the land of Bastion, fool. As for who I am, I'm hurt. I thought you knew me already, Grevin." Grevin growled. "No, I don't know you. And Bastion is still surviving, still thriving. I'm going to put a stop to—" "You'll do nothing!" The voice bellowed, causing the very ground to quake under Grevin's feet, causing him to fall to a knee. He looked around quickly and gasped at what he saw. The very sky was twisting and turning in a dark perversion of itself, while the mountains in the distance seemed to be breaking apart, falling to the earth below, but causing the descent. Grevin, you are powerless, a weak being who could do nothing to help those close to you or those who depend on you. The voice was loud, so loud now it felt as though the very ground quaked with every syllable. He clenched his eyes closed as he felt his anger grow. All the while the voice berated him. You tried to be strong, only to become weaker. You tried to be kind, only to be stabbed in the back. You tried with all your being to belong, only to be pushed away. Grevin could take no more. His anger peaked and bellowed a single word as he slammed his fists into the ground, shattering the very rock he was kneeling on, leaving a deep hole in the earth. Enough! His breathing was ragged as he pulled his hand back and looked at what he had done. The voice merely chuckled as another chill ran its way up to his spine. Oh, Grevin, temper. I don't think you realize just how helpless you are. The voice chided as a slick, black tar-like substance rose from the hole he had just created. It began to stretch out, little tendrils that latched onto his arm and forearm, with an iron grip making him wince in pain. He grunted, pulling back only to have his arm jerked down into the hole, the sticky substance enveloping every inch it could, causing him to fall face first to the ground. The black tar-like substance enveloped his hand, then his wrist, forearm, and then it began to crawl up its way to his shoulder and collar. His blood ran cold as he felt his will to fight begin to leave him. The feeling of apathy washed over him. His vision began to fade as the voice once again taunted him. You're weak, Grevin. You'll always be weak. Grevin's eyes snapped open as he screamed, jerking himself into a sitting position, his hands closed and the fist pulled back, ready to strike. But when he came to his senses, it was already too late. He found himself caught in the forward motion of his punch, which made him roll completely off balance, out of bed and onto his back on the floor, hitting with a solid thud. Sitting up, he found himself no longer on the mountains, but sitting in front of a simple bed with a blue blanket on. There was a simple chest of drawers on the far side of the room, with a small mirror on it, and next to it, in the corner, he noticed a chair that had his armor, forearm guards, leg greaves, and his boots resting simply on his back and cushion, all of which was being washed in the bright sunlight coming from a nearby picture window. He paused in confusion as he took in his surroundings before it hit him that he no longer wore his armor. Panic shot through him as he brought a hand to his head and the other to his chest to see if he still wore his cloak and other coverings. Thankfully, he found that not only did he still have his cloak and hood, he still wore his gloves, black long-sleeved shirt, and leggings. Even his socks remained. He let out a silent breath that he hadn't realized he was even holding and let his hands drop to his lap. He took a moment to collect himself, taking slow, deep breaths before wincing as a small twinge of pain shot through his abdomen. He frowned and raised a hand to his chest, taking note that he had what felt like bandages wrapped around his chest and torso. He slowly brought his feet under him and stood up, being sure to brace himself against the bed while holding his side, and moved to the window, hoping that he would find himself in a quaint little village near the base of the vastest mountains, and that everything leading up to this point was a simple hallucination. He was certain that he had come down with a fever during this trek and passed out. When that had happened, he had to have fallen down from a ridge and been hurt before he had been found by some local villagers who brought him here and patched him up. When he did reach the window, he did indeed see a small, quaint village with quaint little houses, shops all with thatched roofs. However, instead of villagers being people of all ages, shapes, and sizes walking around, going through their everyday lives, they were instead several of what he could only describe as different colored ponies? Yes, ponies. Some smiling, others laughing, some pulling carts or carrying saddlebags, even some serving food at a small cafe, each of them with different symbols on their flanks. What the? This can't be right. I must still be dreaming. Taking a closer look through though, he couldn't help but feel a cold sweat wash over him. He knew that everything he had thought was a dream was indeed reality. He had been pulled through a strange portal of some kind to another world. Adding to it, the people inhabiting this land walked on 4 legs, and on top of that, they seemed quite expressive, smiles and all. There was nothing he could do or say at the moment that would change that simple fact. He would have given this more thought if it wasn't for the sound of hooves fast approaching from the hall outside. His combat training kicked in, making him notice that not only had he made his presence well known, but he also managed to allow potential threats to catch him without his armor, and backed into the room with no easy escape. Deep in the back of his mind, an old lesson sprung forward from when he had learned to fight. If you find an enemy with an ability that could aid you in the future, and they have no way to escape, capture them, learn what they know and how to do it, and then finish them once you have what you want. While he had never done such a thing, and went against his beliefs, he had heard of it happening. He hadn't worried about it at the time. He had helped the one who had caused he caused to be injured because he figured he would most likely be left for dead. Apparently he was wrong. He jumped across the room despite his tender muscles screaming at him not to take things so fast, and grabbed a chair his items rested in, dumping them to the floor. The sound of hooves quickened as he took the chair and ran to the door. As he heard the sound of hooves come within 30 feet of the door, he jammed the chair into the doorknob and propped it so that it would force the door to remain shut. With that done, he ran back to the other side of the room and grabbed his boots. There was no way in hell he was going to be taken without a fight. Scene change. Ponyville Hospital, midday, 3 weeks after first contact. Applejack sat down in the hospital waiting room while she waited to see Nurse Redheart. The smell of disinfectant, rubbing alcohol, and different medicines making her miss the much more enjoyable smells of Sweet Apple Acres. Not to mention, the bland walls of the waiting room were so dull compared to the green and red of the apple trees. She didn't let it bother her that much, since it was her daily time to come by the hospital for a few hours to check on the creature they'd met a few weeks before. Ever since they brought him in, all of the girls had decided to come by and check on him, even if for an hour every day. Even Pinkie Pie and Rarity, who weren't even there when he first appeared, had insisted on being there when or if he woke up. Applejack lightly pawed the ground as she thought back to the morning where they had brought him through Ponyville and straight to the hospital. Twilight had run ahead of them as fast as she could, while still maintaining the force field around him, which, as it turns out, was a very good thing. Not only was Nurse Redheart ready with a large gurney, but the force field had placed enough pressure on his torso that it had actually helped slow the flow of blood, allowing him to be treated much more effectively. Applejack had done her duty as well. There had been several ponies that had tried to take a look at the creature they brought in, some even worrying that it was a rogue changeling that had been captured, but a stern glare and a quick explanation had turned most of those ponies away. The more stubborn ones took a little more convincing, but a quick kick from her leg got the message across quick enough. The 4 of them had not been allowed to go back into the trauma room after Nurse Redheart had taken them back, and thus were forced to wait in the emergency care waiting room, which was nearly maddening. At first, the 4 sat in silence, digesting the events of the day, each in their own way. But when Pinkie Pie and Rarity had joined them, most likely from Twilight informing Spike, who couldn't keep much of a secret, the questions had begun. Applejack couldn't help but smile at the memory of Pinkie Pie bouncing all over the room, asking all kinds of questions. Flashback, 3 weeks prior, emergency care waiting room. Hey, was he all big and scary? Did he have a sharp-looking teeth? Ooh, did he try to drink your blood? She pressed her forehead against Twilight, her bright blue eyes bugging out a bit with the last question, as she raised her hooves ominously, while Twilight tried to back away. Rainbow just sighed and shook her head, a scowl still on her face. No, Pinkie Pie, he was big, and he made it scary for some ponies, but not to me. She crossed her arms and looked down. No, he is way too stubborn. He wouldn't let us help him, and now he could be back there. Her voice softened. Bleeding to death, or something worse. She sighed. A soft squeak from the chair next to her drew her attention back up and over to Fluttershy, who looked very shaken. She had tears brimming in her eyes and a cloud of worry that seemed to hover over her. You don't think that he... She looked down and shook as a small tear ran down her face and dripped to the floor. Applejack and Pinkie Pie were there in a blink of an eye to wrap their friend in a warm, supportive hug. No, Sugar Cube. By the look of that character, he should be doing just fine. She stepped back as Pinkie Pie did her usual job of cheering the group up and trotted over to Twilight and Rarity, who now seemed to be having a more quiet conversation. Rarity was sitting next to her friend and moved a bit, making room for Applejack as she spoke, a look of curiosity forming on her face. Twilight, what do you mean you haven't seen that kind of magic before? I thought you had seen it all, being the element of magic and so well educated. Twilight frowned as she shook her head. I have seen demonstrations on several different forms of magic. Conjuring, transformation, healing, illusions, but the magic I saw and felt tonight, it was different. She looked up at Rarity with concerned eyes and then turned to Applejack. AJ, you saw him first with Applebloom. Did you see him do anything to her by chance? Applejack looked down a moment at her hose before shaking her head, her green eyes lost in thought, thinking back to the rage she felt when seeing that creature hovering over her sister. No, Twa, at least I don't think I did. When I first saw him, he was sitting over apple blooms, seeing a huge unknown creature over your sister. Well, it doesn't make you think straight. I wanted to protect her, so I acted before thinking and gave a solid buck to the face, knocking him away. She sighed as she brought her gaze to meet her two friends, a look of remorse on her face. I should have tried to speak to him first, maybe avoid this whole fiasco. She shook her head as she placed a hoof on Applejack. Rarity shook her head as she placed a hoof on Applejack's shoulder. Applejack, dear, you couldn't have known what he was doing. I would have done the same thing if I had been in your place and if it was Sweetie Belle. You did what any good sister would do. Applejack nodded, letting the subject drop while the room of the trauma ward opened and Nurse Redheart stepped out in her blood-stained scrubs. Excuse me, everybody? The main six paused in their conversations as they turned to face the good nurse, their eyes showing their hope, fear, and concern. Nurse Redheart took a steadying breath as she looked in the eyes of the group and gave them a small, reassuring smile. I think he's going to make it. It was touch and go for a little bit, but it seems as though he has a very strong heart. The sound of a collective sigh of relief cut her off for a moment. However, I do have some concerns. This caused the group to pause in their small celebration. Twilight stepped past her friends, her curiosity growing. What do you mean, Nurse Redheart? The good nurse sat down a moment as she collected her thoughts before speaking. Well, I can explain better after I do a second examination. Fluttershy? The old pony froze with a slight tremble. Yes? Can you and Twilight come back here with me to do a quick check? If I remember correctly, I was told that you were injured at one point too. If that's the case, I just need to do a quick checkup and make certain you're really alright. She gave a soft, reassuring smile to the nervous Pegasus. Fluttershy smiled, giving a small nod of approval before moving to follow Twilight as they went back into the treatment area. Twilight was still a bit concerned with what Nurse Redheart had said before, but wanted to wait to say anything until after the initial check of her friend. So, where will our mysterious visitor be kept now? Nurse Redheart led them to a simple examination room and began to remove her dirty scrubs while Fluttershy sat herself up on the patient table. Well, right now he's in our recovery unit, but it appears he's in a coma and will most likely be moved into a private room in a more secure part of the building. And, despite my better judgment, I'm going to allow him to keep his belongings since you vouched for him when you brought him in. But he is going to be the only one on that level until we can determine if he really isn't a threat or not. Having disposed of her scrub, she turned to face Fluttershy, wearing a small headband with a light on it and a stethoscope around her neck. Okay, Fluttershy, Just extend your wing, please, and let me see where the class had cut you. Okay. She lifted her wing and let out a small squeak as Nurse Redheart pressed her hoof where the cut had been. Well, it looks all right to me from an initial view. She took the stethoscope and took a quick listen to Fluttershy's heart and lungs before stepping back and looking at Twilight. You said he healed her with some sort of magic, right? Twilight nodded as Fluttershy hopped down from the table and sat down next to her friend. Yes, but I wasn't really able to tell what kind of magic he used. Fluttershy, what did it feel like when he helped you? Well, it was warm, comforting, like waking up on a cold winter's day with my animal friends all snuggling around me to keep me warm. Her cheeks turned red as she looked down, her hoofs lightly pawing at the ground. I could also compare it to getting the warmest hug from someone you care about. It made me feel safe, peaceful, and secure. Her eyes had begun to take on a distant, far-away look as Nurse Redheart cleared her throat to draw her back to reality. Twilight's eyes widened a bit as she watched her friend, who had been jerked awake from her thoughts, and looked around quickly before settling and bringing her gaze back to the other ponies in the room. Is that right? Twilight just laughed a little and nodded. That's fine, Fluttershy. Nurse Redheart. Nurse Redheart, why do I get the feeling that there's more to this than you're letting on? What's on your mind? She sighed and sat down and put the medical equipment on a small counter next to her. Well, if I'm reading his anatomy correctly, the injuries Fluttershy gained before his healing spell were very similar to the injuries he had when you brought him into the emergency room. This caused the two to pause with wide eyes. What? Nurse Redheart nodded, confirming what she had said, though her eyes were downcast, showing a look of pure astonishment mixed with worry. I know it's strange, but according to what you told me, you had broken bones and a large wound that would most likely lead to a punctured lung, with cuts potentially in a major artery. He had one collapsed lung, signs of major smoke inhalation in the other, 2 broken ribs, as well as a large penetration wound on his chest, and severe internal bleeding. It was amazing that his heart was beating so strongly. Many ponies would have succumbed to that kind of trauma. Fluttershy looked to be on the verge of tears, trembling at the mental image painted in her mind. To her credit, she lasted 30 seconds before breaking down and running from the room, back into the waiting area where the rest of her friends could help comfort her, leaving Twilight to finish talking to Nurse Redheart. I'm beginning to have my suspicions about the magic he used to help Fluttershy, but I'm going to have to do a bit of research about it to be certain. For now, though, I'll settle on just being happy about every pony being alive and okay for the moment. Thank you for all you've done, Nurse Redheart. Anytime, Twilight. Till next time, try not to get into so much mischief. I'm like any pony out there. I enjoy the days where I don't have to work. She gave us a little wink and smile as she trotted off to do her rounds. Twilight returned to her friends, and after calming Fluttershy down, they decided it was best to try and visit daily when they could, if even for an hour. They figured that since they weren't allowed up on the level he was roomed at, they could at least visit the lobby area and wait. So that's exactly what they did. End of flashback. Applejack chuckled a bit when she remembered how both she and Twilight had to force Fluttershy from spending all her time waiting in the lobby area. The poor thing felt as though it were her. She was responsible for him being there in the first place. But after some pushing from herself and careful negotiation from Twilight, as well as some angry glares from Angel, Fluttershy agreed to return home. Applejack couldn't really blame Fluttershy for wanting to be there when he woke. In fact, she was tempted to take some time away from the orchard to be around more often at the hospital, but her common sense would always remind her that her family needed her too, and those apples were not going to take care of themselves. Sure, Big Macintosh and Granny Smith could handle a good bit of it, but it wouldn't be right for her to just shove all the work onto her kin. Besides, she was beginning to think that he was never going to wake up from his coma. Applejack's attention was interrupted when Nurse Redheart walked into the room. She was giving quick updates to her friends and families of different patients in the hospital, and once she saw Applejack sitting there, she trotted right over. Hello, Applejack. Her voice was pleasant but tired. Must have been a busy day. "Hey, Nurse Redheart, how is the big lug today? Any chance you could be waking up soon?" She sighed, sitting down next to the orange earth pony. "Well, to be honest, I'm not certain. We simply don't know enough about his anatomy. But from what I've seen at his latest bandage changing, his wound had almost completely healed, and his ribs are beginning to set. I've never really seen any pony heal this quickly. There have been stories about Princess Celestia and Princess Luna recovering from great wounds, in old stories, but that are told to us in medical school. But those are just stories, and they are special cases anyways." Applejack nodded. "Yes, I reckon they would be. Well, I just know that several of us are hoping to talk to that feller as soon as possible, especially Fluttershy. And Twilight and yourself, right?" Applejack smirked, her eyes smiling a bit. "Yes, I do want to thank him for helping little Applebloom. She could have been really hurt if not for him pulling her and the other girls out of the fire. But why would Twilight be so interested in speaking to him?" "Well, she had been telling me that the magic she saw him use to help Fluttershy was unlike anything she had seen before. She was pretty curious about it, so I guess she wants to talk to him about it." "Shoot, that figures. So, Nurse Redheart." Applejack paused and took a moment to carefully look around. "I don't suppose you could give me any ideas as to what that feller looks like under all those clothes?" Applejack regretted saying that as soon as it left her lips, but to be honest, the curiosity was beginning to get to her. She had kept her word about not letting anyone see what he looked like, unless it was necessary. That included herself, but after all this time, her mind had begun to wonder. Nurse Redheart laughed a bit as she shook her head. "Applejack, you know I can't tell you. You made me swear it." She smiled at the orange pony, who looked a bit downtrodden with drooped ears and a small frown. "Tell you what, I can probably let you in on a few things we know." Applejack visibly brightened and nodded her head. "Besides, the other girls have been begging me to tell them too. I guess the whole mysterious identity really pulls at Pony's curiosity." This made Applejack pause, her nodding for a moment, but the good nurse thought nothing of it and continued. "All right, I can tell you that he—" Her sentence was cut short by a sudden angry scream, followed by a solid thud from the ceiling above them. Both ponies took a moment to look at one another, their eyes delivering the exact same thought. Without wasting any time, both ponies rose to their hooves and ran out of the waiting room and up the stairs to the next floor, as fast as they could, all while brushing past patients, doctors, and visitors. Nurse Redheart was in the lead, followed by Applejack, who was beginning to worry at the sound of eerie silence in the halls. Rounding another corner, they came to the only room with a closed door and skidded to a halt. Nurse Redheart began to try to open the door, only to find it jammed shut. "Oh no, I think he's barricaded it." Applejack stepped forward with a small smirk. "And step aside. I'll have this open in no time." She turned and planted her hooves firmly to the floor before rearing back and giving a strong buck that shot the door off its hinges and into the room with a settled, loud crack. Grevin jerked his head as the door shot into the room and slammed into the wall next to him. "Shit." He jumped to his feet and moved towards the window. He didn't have his armor on yet, but did have on his forearm guards and boots, so he did the only logical thing in his mind and took on a defensive stance, placing one foot behind him so he could be ready to move quickly. The two ponies walked into the room. One of them was white, with bluish eyes and a red cross on her flank, followed by the same orange one that he had met before. She stepped forward, a small smile forming on her face. "Howdy there, partner. How are you feeling?" Seeing the stance he was in, she knew that she may have bucked the door a bit too hard. "Whoa there, partner. You can relax. Nurse Redheart and I aren't going to hurt you. Not after you help my sister and my friend." He paused a moment, the friendliness of her voice throwing him off a bit. He was expecting there to be some sort of angry threat, not a warm welcome. After her prompting, he slowly brought his hands down to his sides and adjusted his feet so he was standing more comfortably. "Well, other than a bit tender, I'm not doing terribly, to be honest." Applejack grinned, seeing him relax, and turned to Nurse Redheart. Can you send for Twilight and Fluttershy and the others? I reckon they're going to want to see our new friend here. Red Heart smiled and nodded, knowing that Applejack could take care of herself, and stepped out of the room and moved down the hall. Applejack moved closer to Grevin and held out her hoof. Well, I suppose I should introduce myself. Name's Applejack. I help run Sweet Apple Acres, the best orchard in Equestria. Grevin reached his hand forward and took the extended hoof, and to his surprise, he felt a small charge of static pull around his hand when she shook her hoof. His hand followed suit in a hoof/handshake. Well, my name is Grevin Hades. It's nice to meet you, Applejack. He felt a calm smile move across his hooded face, which even brightened the tone of his voice. Pulling his hand back, he allowed himself to rest against the edge of the windowsill, which helped his tender abdomen muscles relax. Am I right in guessing that this is a hospital? Applejack nodded. Yes, sir. You helped Fluttershy. After you helped Fluttershy, you collapsed. We saw you were hurt awfully bad, so we scooped you up and rushed you to the Ponyville Hospital. It was slow going for a bit, but Nurse Redheart was able to patch you up. She leaned in a bit, trying to see under his hood, but was only met with a shadow. She knew that he was a good person. She could tell, but what did he have to hide under there? Slowly, she scooted a bit closer to get a better look. Grevin sat in silence for a moment, not really watching what the Earth Pony was doing until she had managed to maneuver herself nearly to just in front of his feet. Once there, his senses kicked in, and he jerked his head back from her gaze, which caused him to solidly hit the window with a soft thunk. Damn it! Applejack snickered as he pulled a hand back to his head while letting out a small hiss of pain. You should probably be more careful there, Grevin. You still need to heal up. He nodded. Yes, I suppose you're right. He turned to look out the window a bit. Applejack, I have a lot of questions. Questions about where this place is, what the people or ponies are like, and how I got here. Applejack nodded as she patted the bed next to her. Sure, I'll try to answer what I can, but I reckon Twilight will be able to answer a lot more than I can. She moved over as he took a seat on the cushioned surface. I certainly hope so. So, where do we begin? Well, the town you're in is Ponyville, which is in the land of Equestria. We're ruled by two princesses, Princess Celestia, who rules the day, and Princess Luna, who rules the night. Grevin nodded as he tried to take in everything.